Welcome, everybody, to Bodies and Being and our monthly speaker series. And I wanted to get something really cool for you this month, being that it is October. And so we have today Dr. Anna Cusack talking about the executed body in 17th and 18th century London. We'll get to that in just a sec. I want to tell you about us. So, Bodies and Being is a scholarly collective. Myself and Francesca Squiteri met at a conference actually at Leeds. And we got together and realized we were both completely insane and loved doing this kind of stuff and wanted to meet more and more people who were studying the body in some capacity, the pre-modern body. And I know early modern, pre-modern, it's all pre-modern to us. So we have lots going on. We have these talks every month. We host a speaker. If you are interested in speaking, we definitely want to hear from you. We also welcome blog posts if you want to talk about your research in an informal way. Just get maybe your work out there. We're happy to do that. And we amplify these things on YouTube and on our social media channels. We also are more than happy if you want to join our little collective and do some grunt work. We're always looking, especially for social media people, or just if you want to in some way be involved in the behind the scenes stuff. You do not need to be Dr. So-and-so. You can be a student. You can be someone who's never gone to university. As long as you're interested in this topic, we would love to hear from you. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Anna Cusack is a social historian of early modern England. Her background is varied as she began her career in the heritage industry and worked at museums and galleries across London. She completed a BA honors at Birkbeck, University of London, and an MPhil at the Grosseteste University, Lincoln, the University of Essex. Oh, I'm sorry, I messed that up. An MPhil at the University of Cambridge, and for her PhD returned to Birkbeck, and Anna has taught at Bishop Grosseteste University, Lincoln, the University of Essex, Canterbury, Christchurch, Birkbeck, University of London. She's been everywhere, you guys. And at the University of Oxford as one of their continuing education tutors, along with running short courses for the Workers' Educational Association and courses for study abroad students in London. She's held research fellowships at St. Mary's University, Twickenham, the University of Leicester, the University of Erfurt, and the Australian National University, and has worked on projects at Purdue University and Birkbeck, University of London. Anna is an Associate Fellow of the Royal Historical Association and a Strand Convener for the Social History Society Annual Conference. She was a historical advisor for the Executions exhibition at the London Museum Docklands, and gives talks, leads tours, and runs workshops for various organizations. Her areas of specialty are the history of crime, justice, punishment, execution, suicide, religious outsiders, and burial practices, along with the history of London. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Anna Cusack, after I butchered that lovely biography that is so extensive and impressive, to give her talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Autumn. It sounds weird hearing all of those things together, and far more impressive than it probably actually is. But thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. I guess it goes without saying to anyone who read the talk title that I'm going to be talking about executions, and some of these stories are never entirely pleasant, but I figured I don't really need a trigger warning given the title provided. So let's get to it. So I'll start with a story. On the 19th of July in 1700, Catherine van Bergen, Michael van Bergen, and Gerhard Dromelius were executed on a temporary scaffold by the Hartshorn Brewhouse in East Smithfield for the murder of one Mr. Oliver Norris. Now, Catherine was hanged and then buried directly after her execution in the parish churchyards of St. Dunstan and All Saints Stepney. We have her entry in the parish register there. If I can actually click through these. There we go. So this is the parish register, and we have her here, Catherine van Bergen of East Smithfield, on the date that she was hanged. The two men, however, are not in the burial register, as both were hanged in chains, meaning they were put in iron gibbets, and they were placed up along the road between Bow and Mile End. This is the Essex Road that runs into the metropolis of London. So by the 17th century, there's four key things or main things that happen to the criminal corpse after execution. It could be eradicated during the execution process itself, which is what happened to women who were burnt for high and petty treason, so high treason against the crown or clipping and coining, and petty treason for killing your husband or master or mistress. So they would be burnt for that. Corpses could be passed to or taken by the surgeons or physicians to a lesser extent for the purpose of public anatomy demonstrations after their execution. They could have their heads and quarters displayed all around the city on the gates. The quarters, the torsos, the arms and legs would be put up on the gates of the city, and then the heads would be put on pikes at various points. Or they could be subjected to the two methods of disposal that we see in the story of Catherine Van Bergen and her associates who murdered poor Mr. Oliver Norris. They could be put in a gibbet, so those iron cages, or they could just simply be buried. And I should say right now that the burials are by far the most frequent method of disposal. So you can see here, I've kind of broken down some figures. This is from my big database that I have about criminal corpses and what's happened to them. So you can see for the 17th century, we have 56 women burnt, 18 in the 18th century, and so on and so forth. And by far, this largest category is the burial category. Lots of the criminals that I have in my database, I can't trace beyond the point of execution, just due to a lack of records. It's what we face by being scholars. Sometimes there's a silence in the archives. The ones that I am unable to trace, shall we say, probably belong to this largest category of disposal. They were probably simply buried because those that were burnt, displayed, or anatomized tend to leave more detailed records than those who were just simply buried. So what I'm going to do in this talk is talk you through the different methods of disposal. I really believe that, looking at what the ongoing journey of a criminal corpse after execution actually allows us to get at that slightly intangible aspect of the past, which is maybe people's mentalities, how people are thinking and feeling about things. So we'll start by talking about women executed by burning. Burning is actually decline in the 18th century. For the 17th century, it starts off with petty treason being the main reason. But then as the century progresses, actually coining offences take over, and coining offences become the kind of most prominent reason that women are burnt in early modern London. As always, these figures are incredibly vague, and they need to be used with huge amounts of care. I'm not including people outside of the Middlesex, London area, and any accounts that predate 1674 are imprecise at best. More women were sentenced to be burnt than suffered it. Pardons before sentences carried out are very common, and those who did face death by burning were held up as examples in the literature of the day, so we do know many of their stories. For example, on Friday, the 2nd of March in 1688, Mary Aubrey, a French midwife, was sentenced to be burnt for the crime of petty treason. In this anonymous account of her behaviour and execution, we learn that Aubrey had strangled and dismembered her husband, and then been caught and taken to Newgate prison. At about 10 o'clock in the morning of her execution day, Aubrey is collected from Newgate by the sheriff's officers. The sheriffs are the people who oversee executions. She was placed on a sledge and drawn to Leicester Fields. Leicester Fields is where Leicester Square is today. A stake had been erected on the north side of the square, and if any of you are familiar with Leicester Square, this is around where the Empire Cinema is today. So a stake had been erected there. She arrives about 10:30, having taken a good half hour or so from the prison to the site of execution. And there she stood upon a small stool against the stake. A rope is fastened through a hole in the stake and around her neck. The little stool is taken away, and she slowly strangles to death first before they burnt her. As she's strangling, they're piling the wood around her. And again, another half hour or so goes by, and then they light the fire. This is quite a common story for women who are burnt of petty treason. They'll explain the process, but they also fill it with moralizing kind of tidbits and how you should and should not behave at an execution site. So her story is retold in various forms all the way up until 1813. So there's various different accounts of it. This is the earliest, but then we get more as time goes on. There was a ballad about her life. And we also have this rather interesting playing card, the Popish Midwife Burning, which is depicting her execution. So Aubrey's not alone in inspiring such extensive kind of media coverage. Most of the women, especially women burnt for, during both the 17th and 18th centuries, and indeed earlier, are subject to this kind of level of attention, especially petty treason, more so than the coining offences, because that is turning the patriarchal system on its head, as it were. Burnings are actually quite infrequent. They're not a usual method of execution, but they're not unusual. And public opinion towards the burning of women is actually complex and at times quite contradictory. In 1721, a woman called Barbara Spencer was burnt for coining, and her execution is moved at the last minute from an area called Smithfield to Tyburn, which is that most famous of London execution sites, due to petitions from the former location, so from around Smithfield, saying that they don't want women burnt there anymore. The petition for the location change isn't about stopping the execution. They just don't want it to happen in their backyard. It's a NIMBY petition. The population of London don't really seem that concerned with this form of execution, just as long as it's carried out away from everyday life or it won't disrupt their everyday life. We might start to see mentalities changing, and we do kind of towards the end of the 18th century, but this change will come, as the historian Simon Devereux has argued, it comes not from the people of London, but it comes from these elite men in government still. Popular opinion seems to accept the burning of women more readily than later legislation appears to demonstrate. Yet by 1786, when Phoebe Harris becomes the first woman burnt for coining outside Newgate prison itself, because they moved the location of executions from Tyburn to Newgate, it's clear that this method of execution for women was being questioned by these elite men in government, and maybe a little bit on the ground as well. Her execution, so I think this is 1786, her execution is still attended by some 20,000 people. And they reportedly amused themselves with kicking about her ashes once the fire had died down. Now, the historian Vic Gattrell has interpreted this action as the way that people needed to assimilate the awe of the crime and punishment within themselves through their feet into their bones, as it were. However, it's possible that this behavior may connect to the folklore ideas about healing through the touch of an executed criminal, which was noted on several occasions from the 18th century, mid-18th century onwards. Kicking about the ashes could also be interpreted as a kind of way to expunge all memory of the condemned. By destroying her ashes, they're attempting to kind of block any access to the afterlife. But there is a lot of emphasis placed on even criminals dying. Well, apologies about the meowing cat. And there was lots of debates about the resurrection being a bodily experience, not being a bodily experience, rather being a spiritual one. So I'm not quite sure how these interpretations work when you think about that. This is the only case where we have that explicitly noted, the kicking about the ashes. The execution of Phoebe Harris was reported by a variety of newspapers in various ways. Most of them just explain what happened. Some of them point out the behavior of the crowds, and a few of them start to debate the moral implications of burning women. 6 years after Phoebe Harris's execution, so remember, she's executed in 1786, we start to get our last people facing this type of punishment. So we get Christian Murphy, alias Bowman. She's hanged and burned outside Newgate again for coining offences. She's our last official woman executed in 1789, actually. She's not the last one to receive the sentence of being burnt. That title is reserved for a woman called Sophia Girton, who was meant to be executed in 1790. But while Girton is awaiting her execution, what she doesn't know is that Sir Benjamin Hammett, the MP for Taunton, has moved a bill in Parliament to alter the law of burning for women, and he calls it a savage remnant of Norman policy. He'd witnessed Christian Murphy's earlier execution, and this had kind of driven him to bring this bill to Parliament. So by 1790, it is no longer legal to burn women as a form of execution. The act that he brings is passed, and it made the substitution that in all cases of high and petty treason, women were to be just simply drawn and hanged. So the burning of women in London, although a really small percentage of the total number of criminals and indeed total number of female criminals who were executed, clearly were imprinted on early modern mentalities. And they're not the only type of execution method that's really quite extreme, shall we say, where it must have left a real imprint on the mentalities of the populace. Men who were displayed after their execution fall into those two categories. Either they're hanged, drawn, and quartered, or they're hanged and then hanged in chains or gibbet cages. So let's turn to think about them for a moment. So the practice of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was settled by a statute of treason of Edward III way back in 1352. So it's been the standard method for quite a long time by the time we get to the 2 centuries I'm talking about. It probably even had earlier origins than that. And arguably one of the most famous early cases is that of William Wallace in 1305. So before that act itself is even passed. William Wallace, Braveheart, Mel Gibson, for those of you who are wondering where I am. Wallace himself, he's drawn on a hurdle to the gallows at Smithfield. He was actually executed in London. He's hanged, he's cut down while still alive. His heart and his bowels are taken out and they're burnt. And then his body is quartered. He is decapitated and his head is recorded as the first one placed on London Bridge. His quarters were sent back to Scotland. So his body parts are sent back to Scotland and they're displayed there. Actually, they go to Newcastle as well. So Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth are where his quarters are displayed. And then for roughly the next 600 odd years, this method of execution and display continues to be carried out. So many of the quarters of individuals executed in London, and especially the heads, were placed up at various points across the metropolis. And the most famous location is London Bridge, heads on London Bridge. During the 1590s, we have a travel writer called Paul Hentzner, and he records about 30 heads on London Bridge. So there's a substantial amount of heads being displayed in the capital. Now, up to 1577, they were on the north side of the bridge, and then they moved to over the Great Southern Gate, so the Southwark side of the bridge. And you can kind of see on this little image of London here, this is pre-fire image, that on the south side of the bridge, there's all these spikes at the top with little balls. These are your heads on spikes. And that's what you're looking at here. The very last head to be put on London Bridge was that of a gentleman called William Staley. He was executed at Tyburn for a drunken threat he made against the king during something called the Popish plot hysteria, where there was a completely kind of made-up plot that everyone was worried about that was going to assassinate Charles II and his brother James. Now, Staley probably, I mean, it's a made up plot. He probably had nothing to do with any of this, but he's charged as a traitor and he's taken to be executed. The king initially allowed his family and friends to take his body and give him a proper burial afterwards, due to a petition that they sent out to the king. His family and friends kind of then misstepped, shall we say. They organized a grand funeral for him at St. Paul's Covent Garden, and this ceremony and the pomp around it and the media coverage it received annoyed Charles II to such an extent that he ordered the body exhumed, and the quarters were then taken up again and put on the gates of some of the 7 gates of the city. And Staley's head, as I said, is that last one placed on London Bridge. This idea of exhuming a corpse and then displaying it is also not unheard of. In 1661, famously, Oliver Cromwell, oh, this is Staley, apologies, I forgot to put this slide. This is him being drawn to the place of execution. But as I said, he had the full sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, and then his family thought that they had the benefit of burying him, but sadly it was not the case. Okay, but yes, exhuming people and then displaying them again. This happens to Oliver Cromwell. There is his lovely head. He's one of, well, I'm sure you're all aware who Oliver Cromwell was. So when Charles II comes to the throne, all of the regicides that he tries to make an example of, and Cromwell, who has already passed away, is taken to Tyburn. He's exhumed, taken to Tyburn, where he's ceremonially hanged and beheaded. His body is actually buried in a pit there, and his head placed upon a wooden pole at the south end of Westminster Hall. Now, his head goes on quite a journey. I don't have time to go into it, but it's worth looking up in your own time. So Westminster Hall is another location that we have heads displayed. That we include some of the heads from the gunpowder plotters in 1606. Thomas Armstrong, one of the Rye House plotters. You can see his execution, rather grisly execution being displayed here in this etching. He had his head up on Westminster Hall, and some of his body parts actually, again, sent out of London. They went to Stafford. So this idea of sending some of the body parts back to the person's home, town, country, city, village, whatever, is something that occurs over and over again, because these people are meant to be warning beacons, as it were. They're meant to be made an example of. James Holloway, the other Rye House plotter that was with Thomas Armstrong. Rye House plot was another plot that was actually a real plot. But yes, James Holloway's body parts, his head and quarters, were sent to Bristol, and they were fixed on the gates there. So body parts moved around a lot. In London, the third place that we have heads displayed, so we've got London Bridge, Westminster Hall. The third place we have is Temple Bar. Now, this is Temple Bar. It's been rebuilt by St. Paul's Cathedral today, but it used to be where the Inns of Courts are along Fleet Street. So it displayed the heads of traitors, normally only 3, not as many as London Bridge or anything like that. One of the earliest heads noted here is actually from 1685, and it was a gentleman called John Ailoffe. He was a Whig. He was also involved in a plot, as most of them were. He was executed in a temple after a failed suicide attempt with a penknife. So heads are continuously displayed at Temple Bar until the end of the 18th century, long after the rest of the gates in the city of London, Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate, Cripplegate, Moorgate, Bishopsgate, and Aldgate, are all demolished and no longer displaying quarters. So quarters could quite often be buried, but heads continue to be displayed for quite a long time. And the people of London would have been confronted with the heads of executed traitors on an almost daily basis. We have other interactions with these heads as well. Sometimes they are stolen away. Sometimes this is Fletcher. He was stolen away to be buried in his family crypt by some members of his family. And we have other cases where it seems that someone goes up and just takes them and puts them into their cabinets of curiosity, shall we say, which happens once or twice as well. So even though the sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered continued infrequently to be prescribed, the practice itself is never really carried out in its entirety after the 1780s. The last individuals in London who actually received the sentence to be hanged, drawn, and quartered are the Cato Street conspirators in 1820. They're only hanged, but they are then decapitated. So the quartering aspect is removed. So first London Bridge in 1678, Westminster Hall in 1696, and then finally by the mid-18th century, Temple Bar cease displaying criminals in this manner. And Londoners would no longer be confronted with these grisly body parts as they moved around the city. So here you can see these are, I don't know if it's very clear, but the little orange dots are our gates of the city. That's the old Roman wall that you see there. The city jurisdiction extends beyond this, obviously. And then those big red circles, they're the three locations where heads would be. So body parts on the orange dots on the gates and heads in those three locations. Very prominent locations in London. As the metropolis kind of expands and rapidly outgrows this old city centre, over the 17th and 18th century, maybe these body parts no longer act in the same way that they potentially did earlier. Instead, potentially it's the criminals who were hanged in chains who fulfill the purpose that maybe this earlier form of display and even like once had, but even as they kind of are simultaneous for a long time, hanging people in chains becomes the preferred method of displaying a criminal who has been executed. So the practice of displaying executed felons by hanging them in chains has only relatively recently received attention by scholars, namely the historian and archaeologist Sarah Tarlow. And the practice itself has quite an unknown origin. Certainly by the mid-16th century, it was a common form of post-mortem punishment. In earlier cases, the individuals who were hanged in chains were potentially displayed while still alive, and their death would have been brought about due to starvation and attacks from the elements. And this is allegedly the execution method used against Robert Aske, who was one of the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1537. But by the 17th century, you are already hanged, you're already dead before you're put into these cages. So TV lies at you when it says, you know, pirates in gibbet cages and things like this. Any kind of offense could end up in these cages: murder, robbery, desertion, piracy, mutiny, sedition, arson, horse theft, highway robbery, mail theft, burglary, housebreaking, smuggling, ship theft, serving on a French privateer, and shooting at someone. These all have come up as reasons that somebody has been put in chains. No women were ever put in chains in England, although one woman overseas under English law was put in a gibbet cage. And in other countries, the practice was carried out against women as well. For example, in 1664, a Danish girl named Elsha Christians, who murdered her landlady, was displayed near Amsterdam on the northern shore of the Ij, actually. And two images of her were drawn by Rembrandt, and you can see her here. So this is a slightly different display. She's not got a cage. And we think that earlier methods of hanging in chains would have used chains much like this and not a cage. Hence the language that still is used throughout the 17th century. But our criminals in the 17th and 18th century are put in gibbet cages. So, and then they're put on this kind of pole. It's about 30 meters high with a cross beam that supports this kind of cage. And we have variations on it as well. At the forefront of this image, this etching here, you can see there's a cross beam, and there's actually multiple bodies in gibbet cages here. We have one cage that exists for London. There's a few other cages outside London, but there's only one that still exists today. And it's in London Museum Docklands, and this is what it looks like. It's potentially from one of the gibbet locations along the Thames. The cage had no support for the arms, which presumably hung freely outside, and the torso hoops and collars are hinged and bolted, and therefore they're adjustable. The leg sections are not. There is, strangely, with this gibbet cage, evidence of restoration and reuse, which is quite rare. Individuals were measured to fit their cages perfectly, and they were all designed with one individual in mind. So a reuse of a cage is something that's quite special. Now, gibbeting an individual is quite expensive. They've already gone to the execution site. They've already had an execution, which in itself is an expense. And then they have to have this other event, this other ceremony, as well, in a way. And these bodies, we know about the expense of them being put in gibbet cages due to something called sheriff's cravings. Now, this is what a sheriff's craving looks like. These are the sheriffs oversee the erection of the gibbets and the security needed for all of this, but they also oversee the executions themselves. And you can see this is quite an expensive affair. We've got one here that's £15 for Williams's gibbeting, as it were. It's really expensive at the time. Bodies also would go quite far after being hanged at Tyburn in London. We've got some smugglers that are sent back to the Kent coast or the Sussex coast to be put in gibbets out there as well. So additional expenses. And bodies travelled well over 50 odd miles from the place of execution to their gibbet sites. And it's quite fascinating to track how far these bodies move. This is where most of the gibbeting locations are around London. And as you can see, London's that little cluster in the middle there. There's nothing really in the centre of London. The closest we have are the ones along the Thames. The Admiralty Court really, really liked gibbeting people. The ones outside are on major heaths and roads that lead into the metropolis. So as you come to London, as you migrate to London, maybe from a rural village or town, you would pass these gibbeted bodies. Now, gibbets were anthropomorphic, even after the human remains had kind of disintegrated and fallen out through the cage or indeed been taken down. They were quite eerie. The noise and movement they produced must have played a role in how they were perceived by the population. They were subjected to visible decay. And we again sometimes see petitions to relocate gibbets. Not against gibbeting, but can it not happen in my backyard? Or this area has become too built up. Can we move them to another common? Or can we move them to the other side of the common, or so on and so forth? So people don't seem to be overly bothered by the actual method of display, but more so that they just don't want it to happen where they live and work. Sometimes they complain about the smell as well, because I'm sure it would not have been very pleasant. And gibbeting, as I said, much like an initial hanging, is a social occasion. And we have people interacting with these bodies in quite an interesting way. Sometimes we have people trying to climb up and free the bodies and steal the bodies. The gibbets are designed to prevent this. There's nails in the wood to stop anyone trying to climb up the pole. But people persisted, as it were. There's a gentleman called Ben Childs. He was a highwayman, actually. He's executed for theft of the Bristol Mail in 1722. And when the smith came and measured him for his iron cage, he said he wanted them to make it as fine as possible, for he expected, he said, a vast number of people to come and see him in his new suit. They did indeed come. Peter Conway and Michael Richardson's, they're hanged in chains on Bow Common for a murder, and newspapers reported the behaviour of the crowd, voicing outrage that a fairground of sorts had been set up, and there were booths that were selling like Mentos and alcohol and miniature gibbets. And allegedly people climbed up the gibbet, and one man climbed up Conway's gibbet and said, "Conway, you and I have often smoked a pipe together, and so we shall again." And he lit up a pipe and stuck it in Conway's mouth. In Greenwich, telescopes would be hired out so that people could view the gibbeted pirates on the other side of the Thames. And when these bodies were actually removed, some newspapers complained that holidaymakers were deprived of their amusements. So these bodies were very much seen as part and parcel of the landscape, but also had a type of entertainment value. And as I said, it's those individuals hanged at execution dock under the Admiralty Court, more so than your other criminals, that really get the gibbeting treatment far more frequently than anyone else. You can see this a little bit. This is William Hogarth's Industry and Idleness series, where there's a gibbeted individual at the edge of the Thames here. And then just in this perspective of the Thames, someone's just saw fit to include a little gibbet on the side, just showing how frequently these must have how visible these must have been for anyone traveling the Thames. Men continued to be gibbeted in England until 1832, but the practice had declined substantially. Indeed, it actually peaks before being formalized in law, which happens in 1752. And then by 1834, it's abolished completely. So hanging in chains placed the body in an ambiguous liminal space, a place neither sacred nor profane, betwixt the earth and sky. Gibbeted bodies were recognizably the bodies of individuals, yet they were more often than not left in situ to vanish over time as nature took its course. Not unlike women executed by burning, although over a far longer period of time, they were meant to kind of just disappear, fade away until nothing is left of them, rather, other than memory and indeed any kind of media. So gibbets are visible, eerie, disconcerting, and attractive to Londoners, while functioning as a kind of warning against crimes. And they seem to have been accepted by most people, and people's mentalities towards them do not seem to bother unless it was literally right where they lived and worked. And anatomized individuals are slightly different, so we'll quickly turn to look at those. This is the method of postmortem punishment that people feared the most. So after the statutory incorporation of the Barber Surgeons Company in 1540, the barber surgeons were entitled to receive 4 criminal cadavers annually for dissection from the execution sites. This number rises to 6 bodies by the time we get to Charles II in 1660. And that 1752 date I said earlier, we get an actual law passed, the Act for Regulating the Disposal of Execution of the bodies of murderers. So by that point, the surgeons, because it's only the surgeons by that point, are allowed to take the bodies of any murderers, or they get put in chains. So murderers are no longer entitled to have a burial. Until this act, the history of taking bodies of executed felons for the purpose of anatomy demonstrations had been quite complex and quite problematic. And as I say, it's not only the barber surgeons that are taking bodies, and later the Surgeons Company, as the company splits in 1745. We also have the Royal Company, well, what will become the Royal Company of Physicians. And the Company of Physicians are entitled to bodies as well. And there's lots of other private practitioners that are trying to get their hands on these bodies to learn about medical practice. The physicians seem to have performed dissections far less frequently than the surgeons, and the two actually have a lot of tension between them. However, both professions continued to work in tandem with their efforts to claim bodies from execution sites throughout the 17th century. So from a medical point of view, there must have been interest in both male and female cadavers. However, it's mostly male cadavers that are anatomized, or at least publicly anatomized. We do have some women there, but again, our female criminals are low percentage in general. There were already really early on hints of conflict between the Tyburn crowd, so the crowd that came out to watch executions, and physicians and surgeons. And these tensions gradually built in the early 18th century due to social factors explored by Peter Lineborough in his groundbreaking essay about Tyburn riots. Both physicians and surgeon companies petitioned the government to actually help them and protect them taking bodies from these gallows sites. The physicians actually asked for an act of parliament to legally assist them in obtaining criminal corpses. And when this wasn't forthcoming, by 1720, they just stopped taking bodies. So it's just the surgeons that we're dealing with in the 18th, for most of the 18th century. And they ran the monopoly on taking dead bodies from execution sites. And it's them who had to come up against the people of London. However, the people of London at times freely handed over bodies to the surgeons. There are some cases where the people of London really were not happy. And one such was the case of Sarah Metyard and her daughter, and they were hanged in 1762 for the murder of their own apprentices. And the Tyburn crowd really freely handed these bodies across to the surgeons because they believed that they deserved this further punishment. They were very hostile to these two criminals. Likewise, the death of Mary Clifford at the hands of Elizabeth Brownrigg followed a kind of similar series of events. And this is actually Brownrigg here. So Brownrigg was really freely handed over to the surgeons. Loads of people went to see her dissection because these are public dissections. And after her dissection, her skeleton was cleaned and was displayed in an alcove at the wall of Surgeons' Hall. And in fact, they still have it today. So the Met Yards and Brownrigg may have been taken for dissection with no problems arising. However, other bodies were not so freely handed over. And we have full-blown riots, especially if the person belonged to a trade, was a sailor, was an Irish person. The community that they belonged to would really put up a fuss and really try and fight to take these bodies and make sure they didn't end up on the dissection table. Anatomization was often referred to as more terrible than death. And there was lots of concerns about what would happen to your body after the Last Judgment. Now, this practice, the practice of taking bodies from of executed individuals for the purpose of anatomy demonstrations, continue into the 19th century. The Royal College of Surgeons is established in 1800, and they're still taking bodies from execution sites all the way up until 1832. And this is where we have stronger regulations put in place, and criminal bodies were no longer used for anatomy. Bodies are either donated at this point or taken from the poor of the parish. So the bodily remains of anatomized criminals, they're either interred or kept as specimens, even when they are buried, and thus kind of returned to the community of the dead. Their bodily integrity had been completely destroyed, and 2/3 of the human material is disposed of during the dissection process itself. So there's very little actually left to bury. Losing personal identification in this manner, being cut up in this manner, really, really caused concerns amongst the people of London. And this is the post-mortem kind of treatment of the executed corpse that really comes up with against the most tension and the most upset amongst the people of London. What people wished for was simply a burial. So this is the example of what normally would happen to most of our criminals who were executed. So this is on the 4th of May in 1677. We have Robert Dean, William Dean, and Margaret Dean. They're all siblings of Enfield. They're executed at Tyburn for barbarously wounding one Jane King, who had rejected the advances of a man called of Robert Dean himself. So he told his brother and his sister, and they all three had attacked this woman. They'd cut out her eye, they'd mangled her nose, cut off her lip, and slit her tongue, and they'd slashed other parts of her body as well. All three deny the crime. They are noted by the Ordinary of Newgate, who's the chaplain who's tasked with spiritual welfare of prisoners in the prison before their execution, of going to chapel regularly and being quite penitent, but they never confess to the crime. They're all taken to Tyburn and hanged, so simply hanged, and then they're taken back to their home parish. So the parish they come from, St. Enfield, St. Andrews, and that's where they're buried. And the burial register here, it's a bit hard to read, but it says, Deans, be it remembered that William Dean, Robert and Margaret Deans were all three brought down dead from London and were buried all three in one grave upon the 6th. So many criminals such as the Deans were returned, as I say, to their home parish after execution for burials. Family members were often buried next to one another. Criminal siblings could end up in the same graves as the Deans were. Spouses or parents and children, they were often subject to the same practice. Sometimes executed criminals were buried next to each other without even knowing each other or being executed for any kind of the same crime. And they formed, therefore, their own kind of post-mortem nucleus. So in burial grounds, but this differs from parish to parish. So it was all at the discretion of the parishes themselves. Over the kind of 2 centuries I look at, we see lots of parishes taking bodies for interment, regardless of them being their home parish or not. And we start to see a trend for bodies to be slowly pushed beyond those internal parishes. So those internal parishes of the City of London are no longer taking executed bodies for interment over the centuries. So slowly they're being pushed out to the newer burial grounds. This probably was for space reasons and indeed fiscal reasons as well. So after 1753, with barely one or two exceptions, the City of London is no longer interring and burying executed bodies. We do start to see a rise in the 18th century of nonconformist and non-parochial burial grounds taking in executed criminals for interment. Their burial fees tended to be a little bit cheaper anyway, and this is probably why that was the case. Any individual who's from the upper spheres of society, so people who are a little bit better off, more middling sort, they most often get returned to their home parish and indeed to their family homes and crypts and things like that. And this is even those individuals who are the nobles beheaded as traitors. So these nobles who are beheaded as traitors, we're talking about people like Walter Raleigh, they don't get displayed. William Laud, and very, very famously, of course, We Killed a King, Charles I. They don't get displayed after execution, these people. So Charles I, he's executed in 1649. His head is held up to the crowd, but afterwards it's actually sewn back on his body, and it's then taken to Windsor to be interred. And then that last beheading we have in London is of a man called Simon Fraser, Lord Lovat. There he is. And he is executed up at Tower Hill due to the Jacobite Rising of 1745. And he's buried immediately afterwards in that chapel in the Tower of London, St. Peter ad Vincula. He was meant to be returned to his home in Inverness, but they decided that the journey of his body was actually going to cause too much disruption. Crimes don't actually dictate burial locations. Even murderers, up until the 1752 Murder Act, can be buried properly. So, for example, on the 31st of August in 1657, Nathaniel Butler was executed for a murder. A pamphlet on his life explains, here it is, as soon as he was dead, he was cut down, put into a coffin, and carried away in the same coach wherein he was brought, in order to his interment, which at night, by some of his relations and friends, was decently performed in the churchyard of Gregory's by Paul's. So he's just cut down and put in and buried quietly. They don't want to cause too much fuss, but he's a murderer and he's still getting a proper consecrated ground burial. On the 24th of September in 1722, Matthias Brinsden was hanged for the murder of his wife. He was not a sympathetic character at all. He was also suspected of incest with his daughter, but he nonetheless is still decently interred in consecrated ground at St. Anne's, Blackfriars. As I say, bodies move around as well, and the longest journey I have is one from 1616 where the remains are actually taken all the way to Spain, which is quite impressive. But other journeys are far closer, or at least stick to the British Isles. We get lots of bodies returned to Scotland, and then in the home counties a lot, Kent, Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, Surrey, and as far as Wiltshire as well. And this happens constantly, so this isn't just one-offs. And then we have some bodies that never really leave the execution site at all, not because they're burnt, but because they're simply buried in a hole near the gallows for want of friends. That's the term they often use, for want of friends. And it's impossible to quantify how many criminal corpses receive this treatment, but we've got a newspaper article from 1753 which highlights how common it must have been. They reported that on Tuesday, some men digging for ballast near Tyburn, they found above 40 human skulls and a quantity of bones, supposed to be the remains of persons who were executed and buried there for want of friends. So that term, for want of friends. Rarely does a named individual appear buried at Tyburn. However, Sawney Douglas, executed in September of 1664 for highway robbery, was buried in Tyburn Road. Tyburn Road is the Oxford Road, is Oxford Street. On the 26th of July in 1736, Thomas Reynolds was executed for tearing down turnpikes, and he had a coffin brought to the execution site for him, where they also intended to bury him. So he's getting buried in a coffin by the site of the gallows. And as his friends were putting him into the grave, a woman wanted to see his body, so they opened the coffin, and the sight that greeted the spectators was that of a breathing and moving body. So the Ordinary of Newgate, he wrote in his account again, the mob favouring him, lest the officer should take and execute him again, they carried the coffin along the Oxford Road. And a surgeon is called, who attended and him and tested that he was still alive. And then he's carried 2 miles away from Tyburn, but he dies on the way. And they just dig a grave by the road and put him into a burial there. So bodies subjected to interment, to burial. These are often bodies that are attractive to resurrectionists, to body snatchers. And we have newspaper evidence of this going all the way back to the beginning of the 18th century. We've got a report here from 1749 saying on Thursday morning, oh, it's this little bit towards the end here, on Thursday morning, the bodies of three of the malefactors who were executed on Wednesday last at Tyburn and buried afterwards near the gallows were dug up, put in a cart, and carried to the houses of some private surgeons. So here we see our dissection and burial crossover, as it were. And these bodies, especially those by the gallows, they're attractive to surgeons, and they pay a lot of money for this stuff. So even though evidence is rare, these bodies must have been in quite a vulnerable position. Down at Execution Dock, where we have all of our pirates and the Admiralty Court, we think that they also buried unclaimed bodies near the gallows, but because they only have jurisdiction over water, the bodies are only hanged when there's low tide, and then therefore they're buried at low tide as well. And often it says in the 1 or 2 instances that I've uncovered, buried on the Kentish side of the river. So they put them on the other side of the river. Sometimes we get a lot of ceremony enacted at a burial. So we have big pomp and ceremony, great funerals, and these sometimes can cause other issues. We've got an execution. Oh, no, that's not the one. We've got an execution in 1772 for a man called Peter MacLeod, and he's given quite a great funeral. His family attend the funeral. He's a young boy. And the crowd actually beat up his family because they believe that it's them who did the crime and not their son. So these kind of issues take place as well. And the public could take agency of these corpses and decide who deserves what. At the end of the 18th century, executed individuals are almost exclusively buried at St. Sepulchre's and then finally within Newgate itself. Certainly by the 19th century, they're buried in this passageway in the prison. It's 10 feet wide and 85 feet long, and they're placed in the walls and floor and disposed of in quicklime. And we see their names are carved in the passage here. This is actually the Cato Street conspirators. These individuals have now been reinterred in the City of London cemetery. So changes occurred in all methods of disposing of the executed body within both the 17th and 18th century. Until the 1752 Murder Act, the crime that an individual was executed for had little to no bearing on how their body was treated after execution, apart from the burning of women for high and petty treason. Display of executed cadavers were pushed out of everyday life of the early modern Londoners to encircle the growing metropolis. Heads and quarters began to disappear, and that method of disposal really starts to be frowned upon. Anatomies are slowly beginning to be recognized for scientific merit, though that takes quite a bit to get going. And there's still a lot of anxieties attached to that method of disposal. And displaying in gibbets is popular, but again, this is something that peaks before we get to the end of the period I look at. Even burials, as I've just mentioned, went through some kinds of transformations. External factors really impact how all of these bodies are treated. Their family, their trade, their religion. I haven't really spoken about that, but this also has an impact. Even their own personal charisma has an impact. And then the mentalities of the people of London really help dictate how these individuals should be treated. I hope I've demonstrated how some of my thinking is going with this research and what I am looking at, and how we can try and grasp that really elusive aspect of what people really thought and felt about something as really graphically confronting as the executed remains of an individual. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. I have pages and pages, literally, of questions and observations and things. So, but I want to give everyone a chance first. We're going to go ahead and take questions, things like that. Is anybody wanting to go first? Because, like I said, I got pages and pages. All right, I'll get us rocking. So, let me pick one. Um, you mentioned coining as sort of the big like offense that women, I guess, were executed for, which was very interesting. And you kind of mentioned, you said something about how it turns patriarchy on the head. Did I hear that correctly? And could you explain a little
That
bit
that
about?
was the petty treason. So
Oh,
when they kill their
oh yes,
husband,
okay,
yeah,
never
yeah.
mind. I
So
get
they're
that
kind of
one.
inverting the stereotypical gender norms of the time. And that's why if a man kills his wife, it's just normal murder and they're just hanged and buried, but or given to a surgeon um after the act. But if a woman murders her husband, you're going up against the whole patriarchal system, not just a murder. If they murder another woman, they don't get banned. It's only if they murder their husband because it's called petty treason because your husband is meant to be your king, kind of in a way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. But the clipping and coining aspect. So most female criminals are done for things like theft. That's the reason that most women are executed for, and they're just hanged for that. We have a real increase in things like infanticide as well, witchcraft. But the reason that women are burnt, the main reason is the clipping and coining. And this is either clipping the edges of coins and melting it down and making more, or indeed just forging and striking or debasing the metal in a coin and getting a mold and being able to create your own fake coins, as it were. So forgery in general. So definite no. We
Awesome.
do have one woman done for seditious libel against the king, but
Oh,
that's the only one lady, Elizabeth, in the 17th century.
awesome. Another question I have. I won't take too long. Oh, I'm sorry. Did someone else thought I just heard a sound? No, that was a lie. Okay. Were there, we talked a little bit about the movement of corpses, which absolutely fascinates me as somebody obsessed with, materiality and corporeality and things like that. And in fact, I've decided that I need to write a novel or something just to use the title, The Peripatetic Life of Heads.
Excellent.
But in that vein, I'm thinking of Margaret Roper, right? Thomas More's daughter, who supposedly steals it through the night to get her father's head and bury it. Um, were there penalties enacted for that kind of thing, considering that clearly his head is put there to be like, you all need to, sign the act, swear the oath. It's a sign, right? So were there
Yeah.
penalties for these things?
Yes, but they also seem to be quite hard to prove. So I'm not quite sure how often it was penalized because in the 2 centuries I look at, we know that somebody takes this head or somebody moved this head or somebody put it into a burial ground but who that somebody is really rarely made explicit. Or a head will fall down and people will just be like, oh yeah, well it fell down, so I just picked it up and took it home. Which happens more often than
I
you
would
than
do
you
that. I mean,
imagine. Which is why I said, look at the journey that Cromwell's head goes on. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, he's up there for a long, long time, and then it kind of blows down during a storm, and then someone picks it up, and then it disappears for a while, and then it resurfaces a little bit like years later, and then it disappears again, and then it resurfaces in I guess a kind of Ripley's Believe It or Not style 19th century thing where they've got it displayed and then it's bought by somebody else. And it's just bizarre the kind of journeys that these body parts can go on in that way. And
yeah.
if you were caught taking one down, you'd probably get in trouble. Yeah, you'd get fined. Um, but if it's just fallen down and you've just picked it up, it's very hard to
Finders
prove. So
keepers.
yeah, so it's an interesting thing to think about, because they do move around a lot, some of these.
Yeah, well, and I'm really struck by um, this interesting juxtaposition of saints and criminals in the
Mm,
sense of both have these sort of like legends about their bodies or even like magical properties. You mentioned that about, the healing touch of the
mm,
executed, and like I'm thinking also of the people who would take their handkerchief or other things to dip in the blood of the executed. Um, and saints, their bodies went on all these journeys too, and you weren't quite sure if what you got was an actual piece of so and so.
mm,
But I think it's also so interesting how like these bodies provoked so much in people,
mm.
is what it sounds like, right? Because you talk
Yeah.
about like the guy trying to get to that they want to bury him in Inverness, but they're afraid that
Mm,
the Jacobites will find this like a flashpoint, right? If his body's like going through Scotland, this might be a rallying point. And
yeah.
I just find that so fascinating. And I had no question. I just wanted to tell you that.
No, no. I think I completely agree with you. I think it's utterly fascinating. That body that I said went to Spain, he was a Catholic, and he was taken to Saint Omar, and he becomes venerated as a saint, and his body parts get
Oh,
eventually they end up back in England in Somerset for some reason. But yeah, these journeys that these remains go on, and also whenever the authorities get really angry with these interments or something, is when it causes extra hassle, extra fuss, like William Staley. Charles II gets annoyed that so much fuss has been done about this body that he's like, no, gonna make an example of it now, even though I've already said that he can be buried.
yeah.
So we do have this kind of pushing up against social control, and bodies are part of that social control, I guess.
Yeah.
Very much so, I
Yeah.
think they're
Wow.
executed bodies. Mm.
There's just so much to think about. I mean, I'm even thinking of Charles Manson and when he died and the fight over his body and the desire for no one to really know where it was going to be. And just like, oh, I've got my head spinning, but I'm wondering if anyone else has a question or anything so that I don't take up all the space here.
Yeah, I was just wondering about their relationship to disgust. Is there, because I can imagine if those kind of things happen now, people would be hugely like, you'd see some people vomiting and things like that. Was there any contemporary descriptions of, how people actually reacted and did they
Mm.
show some kind of disgust?
Yeah, so disgust is an interesting emotion to try and identify in the past. Um, there are elements of it that come up. So, for example, Elizabeth Brownrigg, when she has her dissection, we have a diarist who Wellington's diary, and he says he's appalled. He's not disgusted at the actual
Mm,
execution. He's disgusted at the young women and girls going to witness it.
okay.
So he's disgusted on that front, and he's like, I'm appalled, I'm disgusted that young women and girls are going to witness this dissection, which is interesting. He's not worried about the actual practice. He's worried about the moralizing implications of other people witnessing it, maybe. Um, we do have people complaining about the stench and
Mm,
about, especially of burnings. We do. John Evelyn in his diary, so we have a few famous 17th century diarists. He writes about some poor soul burning in Smithfield, and he uses that word "poor soul." So a
mm.
woman, a witnessed a poor soul burning, but it's harder. It's hard to get at because most of our writers are middling sort men.
Mm.
um, yeah, I think
Or is there shock, maybe?
sometimes there's a bit of shock. Sometimes people get a little bit appalled, but it seems to be it's so elusive. It's so hard,
Mm.
and when you do get the hints at it, it's hard to really kind of nail it down. Is this what are they actually appalled at? Is it the actual act? Is it what's going on? Is it the acts before the crime as well? Is it their performance upon the scaffold? Because it's a performative aspect of dying. You have to stand up. You have to confess your sins. You have to die in a prescribed manner. And if you're not dying in the appropriate manner, people complain. So, but then, this might be slightly graphic, but when you are hanged, your body goes through a lot. So men often, you often defecate and things like this. And it's really odd that in modern observations of anyone hanging, people talk about that, but they don't in the 17th and 18th century. But it must have happened because the same bodily reactions would have occurred. So is it unmentionable? Is this an argument of silence? Is the fact that it's not mentioned, the fact that it is discussed, that people are feeling? How do we get at that?
Or was it just perhaps that like maybe death or violence was a bit more normalized, or I don't know. Like it's just such a different seeming mindset. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I think none of this is unfamiliar to people. So there is a familiarity aspect there that we've now not got. Thank goodness. Hopefully. But I guess maybe, when something's you're so used to it, and it's so familiar, and it's something that confronts you, like you'd walk in and out the city gates quite often and there would be a body part up there, and it's just quite normal to see it. And today that's hard for us to really think about, especially in the Western world, because it's not something we're confronted with on a daily basis. But the familiarity aspect must have certainly had some play there.
Yeah, because I think when they train, say police recruits or something, people will often, if they have to witness an autopsy or something, people will get nauseous or they'll turn pale and look like they're going to faint and things like that. So it's just interesting that people didn't have similar reactions as much, or perhaps they didn't.
Yeah, I think it's true. Especially the dissection one's interesting. We still dissect bodies today. And medical students, they have to get used to it.
Yeah.
They have to do it because otherwise they can't, become surgeons or whatnot. But yeah, it's interesting to think about, definitely.
Thanks.
I feel like Norbert Elias would have something to say about this and his theory of the reformation of manners, but who knows? Any other oh, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I was going to just agree with you. I think it's quite interesting because if you think of the big movements and the kind of the way that narrative history would go through the Enlightenment, and they're still doing this. Like when I first started researching executions, I was shocked that it goes all the way to 1790 that we're burning people. Like I thought it would have finished earlier. We have things like the Reformation of Manners. We have the Enlightenment. We have all of these things that are meant to, the establishment of the Royal Society and all this stuff that's meant to make us more the act of toleration and all of these things, and yet we're still burning people. So it's interesting to put all those other narratives in the same parallels.
And that criticism is often lobbied at places like the United States. Today, it's like, why are we still doing this? Of course, I think you could argue the United States is still an early modern country, but any other questions before we tie this up?
Just stop sharing my screen now. Okay, then I can see everyone.
Oh no, sorry, I thought someone was unmuting. Well, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. And Anna, I think I just saw that you are How To History. I've been following you forever, and I did not even know this.
Yeah, myself and a colleague, Joe Saunders.
So this is another fantastic initiative. Before you go, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's just a Substack where we just kind of share little pieces of snippets of information, shall we say, and also just try and direct people who are looking, say you want to understand Manor Court records better. I've done a little guide to that. Say you're just starting out GIS mapping, there's a little guide there, and just a little bit, a place to start if you're desperate to find something. If you're interested in like in May Day or something, I've written a bit about May Day, and so yeah, it's just got little bits and pieces we've found interesting in our research, but also to help direct other people to where these resources are, what's online, what's not, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, you can either contact me there or send me an email at another time. Very happy to share any of my findings or anything I can do to help.
Anna is being too modest. The How to History blog I use quite a bit in my teaching, actually, because I believe it's important for historians to know how to do history, not just learn history, but do history. So, no,
Oh,
I think it's fantastic. And I appreciate that that's out there, especially in a way that's very accessible to new historians and students. So,
thank you.
yeah. So, and if you don't mind hanging out for a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and just wrap this up and say thank you so much. This was wonderful. I promise not to ask you all 5 pages of my questions right now. But I hope we'll see the rest of you either at one of our monthly colloquiums, which is just a little hangout. It's, just chatting about research. You can come and lurk, or you can share your own comments and questions. Or next month I think we have 2 speakers next month, actually. So yeah, check out bodiesandbeing.com as well as How to History on Substack, and we will hopefully see you soon.
Yeah. Thanks very much for the talk. It was really interesting. Enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for coming. I'm going to stop recording now.